Tire valve stems are a detail that can be easily added to your model truck projects. Here, I'm working on a set of drive wheels for the American LaFrance Ladder Chief, and the first step is to measure the outside of the rim width. Using a vernier caliper, the measurement here comes out to 3/8 of an inch. For scale modeling purposes, I find that putting the valve stem along the midline of the rim is close enough, so I set the vernier caliper to 1/2 of 3/8 of an inch, in this case 3/16, and mark a location where I'll drill the hole for the valve stem. Make sure this hole is located in the center of one of the openings in the rim. Drill the hole out with a number 74 drill, which at 0.225 diameter is just slightly larger than the 20 thou brass wire we'll use to make the valve stem. Make a 90-degree bend in the wire and trim the longer leg to about 1/4 of an inch and the shorter leg to just under 1/8 of an inch long. The most important thing for a realistic valve stem is a square cut on the end of the wire, and I found the easiest way to achieve this is to use a tool from the model railroading section of the hobby store, track cutting pliers. These give a nice smooth square cut with no cleanup required. Insert the valve stem in the drilled hole and secure with a small drop of CA glue. Here you can see how the valve stem is centered in the hole in the rim. And because this is the inside wheel on a set of duals, the valve stem is extra long, so it projects far enough to be reached through the access hole in the outside wheel. With the hub and brake drum glued in place, you can see how the valve stem fits in the space between the drum and the edge of the wheel rim. An optional extra detail item you can add to the outside wheel, which is more visible, is a small bolt head casting glued in place at the valve stem location, which represents the hex portion of the valve stem where it threads into the rim. Here's an example of that hex portion on a real truck wheel. Glue the bolt head casting in place and let the glue dry thoroughly before drilling out the shank of the bolt head casting with a number 74 drill to install the valve stem. Here's a look at the finished valve stem installed on the wheel to the right, showing the hex portion. Also note that the valve stem on the outside wheel is shorter because it doesn't have to project through to the other rim. Here's the completed dual wheel assembly. The valve stems are offset by one hole to get them as close to opposite one another as possible for balance purposes. Another close-up view of the set of dual wheels on a real truck shows why the inner valve stem is longer to project past the inner rim and be accessible through the outside rim. On a front wheel, the valve stem doesn't project out past the face of the rim for protection, but it is located far enough out to be accessible for servicing. For scale modeling purposes, cutting the valve stem off flush with the outside face of the rim is acceptable, as shown here. As with many items in scale modeling, it's easier to leave the valve stems extra long and trim them to length later, rather than trying to fit everything to exact measurements. Here, on the front wheel for the American LaFrance Ladder Chief, the extra valve stem projection is simply cut off afterwards using the track cutting pliers for a nice square finish, no cleanup or filing required. While I usually locate valve stems along the midline of the rim, sometimes a different location is required, as was the case here with this two-piece spoked wheel assembly due to the way the rim went together. Seen from the front, a slightly different diameter of the outer rim and the inner rim are visible, which is why the valve stem was located closer to the outside of the wheel. This wheel is one of the mix-match combination of parts I often get into, with the outer spoked portion from an Ertl S-Series aeronational kit fitted to an ANMT inner rim and an ANMT brake drum, and the whole reason for it was to make a more realistic front wheel than what Ertl provides in their kit. By installing the model valve stems after the wheel is painted and leaving them in natural brass color, you can simulate the appearance of a valve stem on a real truck made of brass tube and also not painted. Here's an example of this on the steer axle and on a drive axle of the same truck. Also, you can see how the valve stems are offset from one another for balance purposes, and being a 5-spoke wheel, they're not completely opposite one another, but they're as far apart as possible. On these resin trailer wheels, I use the vernier caliper to measure to that line visible on the inside of the rim and use that for my location to drill the holes for the valve stems. On the outside wheels, I use bolt head castings secured with CA glue, and here you can see how I'm drilling through the shank of the bolt from the outside of the rim to make the hole for the valve stem. You can also see how there's a distinctive step in the rim, which is why I located the valve stems where I did. On a 6-spoke wheel like this, you can locate the valve stems directly opposite one another for balance purposes. And one last place you can install valve stems is on the spare tires. On the Kenworth pictured earlier, where the valve stems were left in their natural brass color, I did the same thing on the spare tire. Chain holding the spare tire to the rack is from A-line. It's 40 links per inch, and is generally sold as a model railroading accessory. In 1/25th scale, it makes a fairly convincing light-duty chain for applications like this. And the last example is this spare tire on a trailer, in which I did paint the valve stem along with the rim to simulate a rim that had been touched up at some point in its life. Thanks for watching this look at adding valve stems to your scale model truck wheels. It's a simple detail to add, and it does improve the appearance of the finished model.